What is going on, YouTube? Andrew Miller from Hook'emHeadlines.com coming back at you today. I wanted to recap the playoff semifinal games that took place over the weekend and give a preview of the College Football Playoff National Championship game, which is taking place next Monday at SoFi Stadium between number 1 Georgia and number 3 TCU. We did a college football playoff preview show and predicted some of the New Year's Six Bowls last week. Me and Tarek did. So, kind of elaborate on what went right and what went wrong that we expected to take place. Now, start here with the first game on Saturday. Between number 2 Michigan and number 3 TCU. So this game, I think, can be summed up pretty quickly by saying that I definitely, and I know a lot of other people did too, definitely overestimated what Michigan could do in their game planning process. And I would say a little bit underestimated TCU, but I mean, TCU's come up big in these close games throughout the entire season. So them closing out a game like this with how battle-tested they've been late in games this fall, that part of the game didn't really surprise me that they were able to finish off on a high note. On the Michigan end of things, I don't need to dig too deep into like the all of what went down. I'm sure a lot of y'all that are watching this video saw that game. But just in my estimation, I mean, Michigan was just trying to outwit, like, they were outsmarting themselves. A lot of play calls that just weren't situationally effective or overcomplicated, telegraphed oftentimes, especially on defense. Michigan sent a lot of DB blitzes that were very telegraphed or just not very smart, didn't have the right replacement coverage in place. There was a cornerback blitz in this game where the Michigan corner was covering TCU star wide receiver Quentin Johnston. Ended up, I believe, going for an explosive play to Johnston there. That's just, when you don't have their recover safety coming back, which the read there ended up being very late, TCU was able to completely exploit that, and I believe that drive ended up in a touchdown. In run defense as well, Michigan was sending a few safety blitzes that, again, you didn't have kind of recovery man, and there wasn't really any stunts or confusion that could cause some chaos. It was very easy to pick up on and adjust for TCU, whether it be a tight end picking up the blitz or just getting extra help from an offensive lineman up the middle, or Emery DeMarcado in the backfield, pitching in with a block. TCU was able to pick up on a lot of those blitz plays. Michigan on defense in general just had a tough time kind of adjusting to this high-paced spread offense that TCU likes to play, because TCU was able to very effectively get their guys out in space, scheme their guys open. Quentin Johnston had a couple of big plays that ended up contributing the bulk of his 163 receiving yards. Emery DeMarcado was great. I really thought it was going to be a huge loss when TCU saw Kendre Miller get injured, their star running back, but DeMarcado, I believe, ended up with over 150 rushing yards? He definitely had near 9 yards per carry, so he was great. Max Duggan had a couple mistakes here and there, but overall did what he needed to do to get the job done. Michigan was sending a lot of pressure, and he dealt with that pressure pretty well. Looking at PFF, he graded out pretty similar between passing plays where the pocket was kept clean and when he was actually put under pressure. So it shows that he was able to handle that phase of the game well. And then TCU on defense, they're a different defense than I think Michigan has really seen before. And that, for one, on the play calling front, caused some confusion. There were just some Michigan mishaps. I think right from the get-go, that double reverse pass on 4th down at TCU's goal line, where Michigan definitely could have set the tone after a long run play. I just don't think that was very smart. Michigan ends up, again, essentially outsmarting themselves, and that would be something that set the tone for the rest of the afternoon and evening. Another thing was, TCU's defense was able to throw some coverage stunts, different coverage looks at Michigan. That, I guess I'll preface this by saying that I do think J.J. McCarthy played a good game, but there were some mistakes that were obviously very costly. The pick six to Bud Clark was a game changer in this one early on. Really surprised me, but Bud Clark got a good read on the ball and jump the route. You got to give TCU's defense credit where it's due. This is a very physical Michigan offense that has a lot of weapons and a very elusive quarterback in J.J. McCarthy that can also do some damage. And TCU's defense held up pretty well. I can't have anything bad to say in terms of how the flow of the game was going. They played well with kind of a bend but don't break mentality, and forced some turnovers, which ended up being much needed. I believe TCU's run defense held Michigan to 186 yards. I think somewhere in the ballpark of about 4 yards per carry. Yeah, about 4 to 4.5 yards per carry. So considering how much Michigan relies on the ground game, that was big for TCU. TCU also ended up rushing for 280 yards from scrimmage, somewhere in that ballpark. And this is a Michigan defense that was letting up less than 100 rushing yards per game, under 4 yards per carry. I think the way that TCU was able to run the ball and generate some timely turnovers, to take advantage of Michigan mistakes was absolutely critical. I'll get into the run game part of the national championship here in a little bit, though. Also use this as a segue point. Wrap up another exciting playoff game between number 1 Georgia and number 4 Ohio State. A game that looked like it was going in the Buckeyes' favor until pretty late in the fourth quarter, when Stetson Bennett and the Bulldogs were able to get a little rally pulled together late. Ended up going up by 1 point with less than a minute to go, and Ohio State could not knock through the game-winning field goal. Georgia ends up winning 42-41. This game was more of what I would have expected between Ohio State and Georgia. TCU Michigan obviously did not go the way that we expected. I think I had Georgia winning by 8 or 9. So I guess at least spread-wise, I was closer on this one. Georgia relied very, very heavily on the passing game. I got to give Todd Monken credit where it's due. Georgia's passing game came alive when it needed to, and Bennett played a big game. I've been critical of him at times this season, and he just played really well. He was one of the MVPs of this game without a doubt for Georgia, maybe the MVP. Kept making big play after big play late, connecting on some deep balls, holding up pretty well in the face of pressure. He was put under pressure a lot. It was on 30% of snaps. So Ohio State's defense was able to wreak some havoc in the pocket. Georgia kind of lived on big plays in this one too. Kenny McIntosh has been good on the ground this season, and I thought that Georgia was going to be able to run the ball in this game, but it just wasn't a huge factor. They ended up having somewhere around 120 to 150 rushing yards, and a lot of those rushing yards ended up coming on big plays. Again, McIntosh ends up finishing up with 5 carries for 70 yards, which has not usually been the MO for the Georgia ground game this season. Let's see here. Yeah, 135 rushing yards. So Ohio State was able to keep them at bay, and same can be said for Georgia. Georgia held Ohio State to around 120 rushing yards, so neither ground game played a huge role from an overall production standpoint. But, Stetson Bennett, I believe, was close to 400 passing yards, and, 398, and 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. C.J. Stroud was awesome, too, around 350, 4 touchdowns. So, passing games were very, very, very good, very effective. Ohio State's top 2 receivers, Buka and Marvin Harrison. I haven't really checked up on his status the last couple days. Hopefully he's doing well after taking that tough hit in the end zone. But both those receivers end up going for over 100 yards, so they were as advertised. And on the Georgia side, Brock Bowers had a pretty good game. Not targeted a ton, but ends up coming away with 4 catches for 64 yards, so he was still effective. And then Arian Smith had a couple big plays, ends up with 3 catches for 129 yards and a score. Ohio State's defense, again, while they were playing really well in the first 3 quarters, outside of a few slip-ups here and there, big plays started to kind of take hold of this game, and that's what Georgia was able to ride to end up taking the 1-point lead that would ultimately get them the win. I think that the big play aspect is again something I didn't give Todd Monken enough credit for coming into this one. I really thought that Georgia would end up controlling the game more with maybe shorter intermediate passes, and then, really just set the tone at the line of scrimmage, given the size and just ability that they have up front. They've got a lot of big humans on that offensive line, and it's one of the best and most skilled offensive lines in the country. But again, Ohio State was able to generate pressure. Georgia's ground game wasn't super effective or consistent, so that's definitely something to watch heading into the national championship game. On the other side of things, I mentioned C.J. Stroud was really good for Ohio State's offense, 350 in terms of passing yards, 4 touchdowns. Ohio State's wide receivers were giving Georgia's DBs all sorts of fits. And while Georgia was able to muster some pressure on C.J. Stroud, he held up pretty well in the face of it, and especially in the first 3 quarters, was able to pick apart Georgia through the air. So again, something to watch here for the national championship game. And I think this serves as a good transition point here to talk about TCU and Georgia. These are 2 teams on paper that just are spinning completely different narratives. TCU is coming into this game trying to prove that you don't need a blue chip laden team or a blue chip laden roster. Some high powered head coach, blue blood program to be able to win a national championship. They would be kind of changing the conventional wisdom here that you need a certain kind of talent, like blue chip ratio, talent level, to even win a national title. Meanwhile, Georgia's trying to go back to back. They've got some newer players on defense that were first time starters this fall. This is still a blue chip laden roster. A lot of these players were on the team for the national championship game last season, especially on offense. His coaching staff has been there, done that before. So, Georgia, obviously, the favorites on paper, I believe they come into this game as around a 14-point favorite. It might have shrunk down to 13. I would need to check up on that. But I really don't think this 2-touchdown edge is going to be how this game plays out. We saw Ohio State be able to take advantage of some different parts of this Georgia team that, while we might have seen inconsistencies during the regular season in terms of, the ability to protect Stetson Bennett or, maybe the DBs getting exploited at times by better receiving cores. Granted, that wasn't super common during the regular season. Georgia played really well against some of the tougher competition they faced, Oregon, Tennessee being 2 great examples. So there are reasons to believe that TCU can find some matchup advantages here. TCU's receiving core, I think, can be an area where they do exploit some of the Georgia secondary, or, I guess what I'm trying to say is come up with some big plays in this game, but TCU's receiving core just obviously isn't what Ohio State's is. Quentin Johnston is good. I think Tay Barber, Darius Davis, these sorts of guys, Savion Williams, that they're quality receivers, Johnston especially, but between Harrison and Buka, that Ohio State receiving core is just next level. So I think from that perspective, Georgia will have an easier matchup. Running backs, I need to check up on the status of Kendre Miller, but DeMarcado played a really solid game. And if TCU was able to run the ball on a Michigan defense that's averaging about, 95 rushing yards per game on defense heading into the playoffs, Georgia's run defense might be running into a stiff test here. I mean, TCU just went for damn near 300 yards. And they got different ways that they can run the ball, too. Max Duggan is a plenty capable dual-threat quarterback. I mean, if Kendrick's healthy, he's one of the most underrated and one of the best running backs in the country. And then you got, again, DeMarcado, was the guy that was responsible for more than half of the rushing yards that TCU did put up on Michigan. So from all those perspectives, I think that could be a point of concern for Georgia. But for Georgia, a lot of this is just about simplifying your game plan, making sure this base 3-4 defense that you play is something that you can kind of adapt to be able to contest space against TCU, to handle some of the gimmicks that Garrett Riley might try to, and pre-snap wrinkles that Garrett Riley might try to throw at them. But a lot of the reason why TCU broke off some of those big runs was lack of, lane and gap assignments, lane assignments, gap integrity, things like that, and just Michigan, again, outsmarting themselves. So I really do think that Georgia will match up better when you're talking about being able to stop some of the TCU athletes in space in the ground game in particular. And then, I mean, the last part there is just Max Duggan. Georgia's another tough defense that he'll have to face. And while I thought he played pretty well against Michigan and was tough there, he still finished the game with like two touchdowns through the air, 2 interceptions, made some mistakes. And when the pocket was kept clean, it felt like he was rushing some throws. But again, this is a really good Michigan defense, so I expected Duggan to have some struggles there, and I think he'll be presented with another really tall task in one of the most talented defenses in the entire country. A lot of this will hinge on whether Georgia can get pressure on Duggan. Georgia doesn't have one standout pass rusher. It's more of a get it done by committee. This is a team that I believe has double-digit defenders that have at least 1 sack on the season, but there's not one player that's really doing it all for Georgia. So that's going to be something to watch, is how Georgia tries to generate pressure, because, again, Michigan, it felt like they were trying to outsmart themselves at times and overcomplicating things. I don't think Kirby Smart's going to take that approach or make that mistake, but Georgia's going to have to find some different creative ways to drum up pressure, which could leave some of the secondary exposed, and that's where TCU could exploit some advantages in space. At the line of scrimmage, I think you'd still have to give the edge to Georgia if you're talking about Georgia's defense versus TCU's offensive line. Again, Georgia doesn't have one standout pass rusher, but that 3-4 front, they're solid. A lot of linebackers and edge players that are able to plug the gaps, that are able to effectively funnel the run game to the linebackers so that they can clean up when need be. Ohio State has a good ground game, and they were only able to run for 120 yards, somewhere in the ballpark of 3.5 yards per carry. So, even though Georgia was getting beat through the air, that didn't really compromise the effectiveness of their run defense. So, even if TCU is able to get something going through the air, they might have a hard time, staying with a balanced offense, controlling the tempo if Georgia's stopping the run. On the other side of the ball, I think that Georgia can really, I think this is where Georgia can, take some of the matchup advantages they have, and maybe late in this game be able to put things away. Georgia's offense, again, wasn't super effective running the ball against Ohio State. Georgia was kind of relying on some big plays late. Ohio State was doing a nice job tackling, getting hats to the ball, and early on, Georgia was having a hard time setting the tone in that regard. We'll see how that goes against TCU. I mean, I don't know how different it's going to be facing this TCU front that is just, gang tackling so well, getting hats to the football, is, really has some good athletes on the back end of the defense, which I did not give them enough credit for during the regular season. Like I mentioned, Michigan has a lot of weapons on offense, and TCU was pretty sound. I know that was a high-scoring game, but TCU generated turnovers where they needed to. Came with a lot of big plays at decisive points in the game, thanks to a lot of the experienced players on this defense. D. Winters was great. He's been one of the leaders for that team all season. Bud Clark, I mentioned at the back end of the defense, was solid. Travius Hodges-Tomlinson was up and down. It was not his best game of the season, but again, he's still a solid corner that, against some of the smaller Georgia receivers can still, be a matchup issue. So, Georgia's going to have to set the tone from the very start of this game if they want to be able to be effective on the ground. But again, I do think Georgia's offensive line, they're very good. I think they're going to have the edge at the line of scrimmage. If you can win the line of scrimmage, can you get through to the second and third levels of the defense and start getting some chunk plays to stay on schedule on second and third down? I think that's going to be the big question for Georgia at the outset on offense. Through the air, I think that's where Georgia has the biggest advantage. I don't know if TCU really has someone capable of dealing with the threat that Brock Bowers presents. At times, TCU has been prone to giving up the big play this season. That was more in the first half. I thought they adjusted better down the stretch. But, Georgia was hitting some of those deep balls and some of those big plays. This is where if you're able to set the tone on the ground, I think Georgia's going to have more room to be able to beat TCU over the top. I mentioned earlier, Arian Smith ended up having some big plays against Ohio State. That is certainly something to watch. I mean, Stetson Bennett has been throwing the deep ball really well. He's been holding up well under pressure. So, I think that if Stetson Bennett plays at the level he did against Ohio State, this is going to be a really tough one for TCU to keep up with. So that in pretty much every phase, I would give Georgia's offense the edge over TCU's defense. Just in terms of TCU's ability to defend the run, I don't know how big that edge is going to be for Georgia, and I think that's going to be one of the major X factors here. So, looking at this game, if I'm just looking at the matchups here, Georgia's pass offense, run offense versus TCU's run defense, pass defense, and vice versa. I believe I have the edge of 3-1 here with TCU's pass offense potentially getting the edge over Georgia's pass defense, just not to the same degree that Ohio State had the edge over Georgia in that regard. I think that's going to be enough for Georgia to come away with like a one-possession victory. I gave Georgia, again, I think barely a 2-score win over Ohio State when I was previewing that game with Tarek last week. I'm going to give Georgia a one-score edge for the national championship game. TCU's been able to prove people wrong all season, whether it's coming out playing, really solid, really sound defense, getting guys out in space, relying on someone like Henry Miller, Quentin Johnston, or just Max Duggan having a massive game. TCU's found different ways, has found different ways to come up with answers and be competitive literally in every single game this season. So, Georgia has shown some flaws, especially when playing away from home. It's a team that was able to barely beat Mizzou on the road and, was one Ohio State field goal away from, having to go home back to Athens. So I think TCU can give them a good push here, but I ultimately think Georgia will end up securing its second national title. I just think they have too many matchup advantages and that they'll learn from some of the mistakes that Michigan made when facing TCU last weekend. So anyway, that is pretty much it for Andrew Miller from Hook'emHeadlines.com. We will be coming back here with some portal coverage, recruiting stuff in the next 2 days, and then potentially some stuff just previewing the college football offseason next week. That's pretty much it. See ya.